This episode is sponsored by Magic Mind and Wix Studio.
When is the last time you listened to a podcast about web development, web design, and small business and didn't fall asleep? Yes, we cover web development, web design, and small business, but like actual human beings with personalities. If you're a beginner, we're not going to talk over your head. It's more like asking your buddy for help. We have guests, we have fun, and let me tell you, these two can get off on a tangent. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to HTML All the Things Podcast. This is Matt Lawrence and Mike Curran.
That's right, everybody. We are back. This is the HTML All the Things Podcast. This is the first episode, I think, that we're actually recording in 2025. Are we recording this, and then this also has to come out in a few days? Are we still ahead in recording?
We're still ahead by a week. Yeah, we recorded one last week, so we're good.
Holy crap, I don't remember that. But anyway, hopefully your holidays were good. I think we probably already said that last week, so I'm just going to get into this. This episode is titled, Stop Overcomplicating CSS, Master Layouts, Variables, and Modern Best Practices. Now, I want to be clear at this point that this is not a tutorial for CSS or anything like that. This is kind of like a part 2 to my HTML episode where I was talking about semantics and things like that and the importance of having, organized HTML, the importance of HTML overall, and also how HTML is critical in accessibility and things like that. We're going to be talking about similar topics with CSS here as well. And I mean, there's a whole bunch we're going to cover. There's even going to be some goodies sprinkled in here that I won't cover in the show notes that are specifically going to be in the show notes at htmlallthethings.com. So go and check that out if you want more insights here and there. So if this sounds interesting to you and you want to support the show, you can go and check us out on that Patreon, leave a review, a rating on your podcast app, join us in our Discord server, or share this with your friends. And so I think we should just dive right into the introduction, because as Mike, I think you used the words earlier, this is a monster episode because there's quite a bit in the show notes.
Heck yeah, this episode's just buckle in, everyone. This is going to be intense, and you're going to learn a crap ton on CSS.
Yeah, so again, not going to be a tutorial, but you're going to learn a lot of those little intricate little things. Like, I'm not going to be like a class is declared or is used by using the period. No, not going to do that. What we're going to talk about is how CSS is actually a pillar of modern web development that goes beyond aesthetics. So you might not think of it as this, but we know that HTML is the skeleton, right? The structure. If you want to sum it up in a couple of words, that's what it is. Skeleton, the structure of your HTML, of your web page. But of course, it goes beyond that. It goes into accessibility and other areas. And it's no different here. You may think that CSS is just the styling, it's just the aesthetics, and it largely is. However, it really crafts the website in such a way that it can adapt to different devices, which is, of course, responsive design. You can really kind of play with a fair bit of performance with CSS as well, and you can also help with accessibility too. CSS influences the user experience, or UX, by controlling how the content is presented. And this allows people to actually read what's going on, see the images, view the videos, things like that. And CSS is also typically responsible for managing dynamic layouts, usually with some help of JavaScript. However, CSS has really grown in power recently. When I say recently, I mean the last 5, 10, maybe years. And so a lot of the dynamic layout controls are really done either entirely or mostly by CSS itself. So, for example, CSS enables us to use responsive designs that automatically adjust for something like mobile, tablet, and desktop, right? Now, if we think about this, we think, well, obviously, Matt, you just said, well, it's responsive design. But let's kind of dive into the meat and potatoes here and think about, okay, let's just say, for example, we had a data table. Well, a data table is sometimes a lot of columns, lots of rows. And you don't want your whole page to be scrolling like crazy. And obviously, there's lots of columns and things in the columns, a lot of data in the columns. It's going to be a pain to be able to actually see this thing, especially on a smaller screen. And if we think about it, think about the actual cell phone, your smartphone in portrait. You got a really big table. It's going to be a problem to actually view it all. CSS is the thing that controls, okay, we're not going to shrink these table cells, these table columns down too skinny. We're going to lock them at like 200 pixels wide or something at minimum, for example. And then we're going to have it so that the actual table has some overflow controls, and we can scroll left, right, up, down on the actual table. So that is an example, a very basic example, but that's an example of the importance of CSS, especially in modern web development. I mentioned accessibility earlier as well, and accessibility also has a bit of CSS helping it along. So properties in CSS such as focus and contrast and and responsive font sizes ensure that websites are usable by everyone. So for example, you may have something like 2 different colors, right? And you want to put really bright yellow on a pure white background. Well, the contrast of that is not going to cut it, right? It's not going to help. So unfortunately, you're going to have to change the contrast of that manually. You're going to go in, you're going to change the colors. And that's all CSS. Like CSS helps you with that. Now, CSS isn't going to report to you and say, hey, this contrast is bad. You have to do that yourself, but you are in control of those styles. You can also use different units when you're doing font sizes, things like rems or EMs or whatever your accessibility plan kind of dictates. And then that's different than using just pixels, PX, when you're messing around with font sizes. And then I also mentioned things like CSS and it helping performance. Well, it can do that because you can have too much HTML. I know I'm bringing HTML into this, but it is important. You can have too much HTML and too much CSS sometimes. You can have just these layouts that are just totally ridiculous. Like the layout itself is, I mean, it looks good at the end of the day, but by the time it loads, it's like, yo, man, you could have cut down on a lot of CSS, on a lot of structure, a lot of that HTML. And CSS helps with that. So sometimes CSS, the power of CSS can help you. So using something like CSS Grid can help you achieve really complex layouts with fewer lines of code. And in a lot of cases, actually cut down on the amount of HTML you're running as well. This cuts down on the amount of elements. This cuts down on what's being displayed on the screen, even in the background, if it's just sort of being all combobulated in the code before it's displayed to the user. There's less of that combobulation, if you will, if you have good CSS and, of course, good HTML to work with. And then there's also a bunch of modern features that have made CSS kind of a central component, if you will, to some people's design systems. These tools include things like Bootstrap and Tailwind CSS, and of course, there's going to be a whole bunch of others.
I think CSS is one of those things that I think a lot of developers will not prioritize, and for reasons of like, oh, I don't really care what stuff looks like. I just want to get into the code, or I don't really understand how all of these different properties can control an entire web page. I don't want to learn it all, so I'm just going to focus on code, et cetera, et cetera. But the real versatility comes in when you become a developer that understands both the visual aspect of your code, so how to do proper UIs and design in a way that's, or like layout in a way that is responsive and layout in a way that's really easy to read and accessible, versus just a developer that can only do development, like code. It's more and more in these days, people are talking about full stack, and full stack does include the ability to create the full application all the way from scaffolding with HTML, styling with CSS, working on stuff on the front end with JavaScript, and on the back end with JavaScript or whatever other language that you have for your back end. And again, it's just, I want to make it clear how CSS can be a little bit overwhelming for some people because of the amount of different ways that you can style something, and especially when you throw responsiveness into it. But there are some really good pillars you can follow, and again, what we're going to talk about, some frameworks like Tailwind and Bootstrap and all that really do help you get in the visual mindset. And just if you focus on one little thing at a time, it doesn't become overwhelmingly bad. It's not actually that bad, is all I'm trying to say. You just need to overcome that initial shock of like, oh my God, there's like a million different classes that I can apply, or a million different styles. Yes, but you're obviously not going to be using all of them everywhere.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we do when we actually start using CSS right away, especially as a beginner, I mean, like as an absolute beginner, is we don't really use a lot of like the sort of modern features. I don't even know if I want to call them modern features, a lot of the sort of basic features the right way. And this makes CSS seem very, very complex, very, very confusing, and also makes it quite literally really messy and really long, meaning there's a lot of lines of code, properties, and all the rest of it inside of your CSS style sheets. And I mean, a really common one is like, Mike, like when you and I first started, like how many times did we not use classes correctly? Like we would have a content box class, and then we would have a context box 1 class, and they're both the same. And that's like, okay, if there's 6 lines, if there's 6 properties inside of that style sheet, I mean, you could have just had 1 class and skipped those other 6 lines, those 6 properties, because a class can be applied to multiple things. And IDs are definitely misused. I've seen people style everything with IDs, so everything is unique. Everything needs its own bit of CSS, even though a class would handle like 10 of those IDs, right? Or at least parts of those IDs. Combining classes is another thing. And so I feel like a lot of people, especially when they begin, and also experienced developers as well, when they have a project to tackle and they haven't quite gone back, when they have a project to tackle, but they haven't gone back to refactor. Like the amount of times I've gone in, and of course you're just, writing CSS classes, you're just getting this page like set up. You really do need to go back and be like, oh shoot, you know what? Like I could combine these classes. I could get rid of this ID. This isn't used anymore, right? This is old. I could use a % here instead of having 2 different breakpoints, things like that. Like I feel like CSS gets a bad name for its complexity because there's a lot to it, but there is a lot that you can also do to simplify it. Like there's a lot of features at the table, and it's sort of like, don't use, 2 hammers to hammer in 1 nail. You can, but you could one hit, one hit. But why would you do that? Is I think a good analogy for that. So we'll jump in, I think, now to some of the basics of CSS, of course. And what we want to do with our CSS is we want to sort of think about separating the different concerns of our CSS. So we want to keep structure, styling, and behavior separate. And of course, the structure is going to be your HTML. Your styling is going to be your CSS, and your behavior, or your interactivity, as it's commonly called, is going to be your JS, right? So or your interactivity. So what you want to do is you want to have your style sheets or your CSS really sort of be the thing that styles your page, but does even in and of itself have its own organization. So what do I mean by that? A lot of websites will just have, a styles.css. There's one style sheet, you put it on the server, and that's it. That actually does work great for a lot of different websites. We have it on a lot of our client sites because the actual sites themselves don't have a super long or super complex layout, right? The thing is, though, is as your style sheet starts growing, as the site starts growing in complexity, as the layout inevitably gets more and more complicated, you can use, and people don't do this, but you can start to use different style sheets. Multiple style sheets is what I mean. And you can maintain modular style sheets for different aspects of the project. So for example, you may have some universal styles, such as your brand styles in a certain class. So you may put those inside of a global.css file. You may have some reusable elements, like a content box, like Mike and I discussed, and that can be put into a components.css. And you may have specific pages that are like just really specific, like a common one is a landing page for a very specific or niche or maybe one-off marketing campaign. Well, if you're only running this marketing campaign once, or maybe it's seasonal and it's once a year, like, do you really need to add that into your main, styles.css or your global? No. So you may have like a pages.css for page-specific rules. And if it's a really, really complex page, you may actually have like a Christmas.css, and that will be your Christmas styles in particular. You can also use a preprocessor tool such as Sass to divide the styles into partials. So you could have your files be _buttons.scss and _forms.scss, and combine them into a single production-ready style sheet, again, using a tool like Sass. Now, doing your organization like this is not always required. I want to be clear. If it's a simple website, having a styles.css page is totally fine. But if you do use this organization style, what you're getting is improved maintainability. So you're making changes in one layer that does not inadvertently affect the others. And when I say layer, I mean, well, the global is going to be kind of the top layer if you think about it. The components might be layer 2. The pages might be layer 3. And as your website grows, you'll kind of come up with your own layers as you see fit throughout your organization. There's going to be a lot of reusability in here. So styles can be reused across multiple pages or components without duplicating structure and logic. And I'd like to note here also that you can actually reuse some of this stuff across multiple projects itself. So something like a global.css, as I mentioned, has your branding colors. Depending on how similar your projects are, like if you're a company that runs 8 different websites, you may be able to hand out that global.css across all 8 of your websites so that people can easily pull the standard branding colors, like brand main, right? Brand main inverted, brand main dark mode, things like that. Those are things that you may be able to throw them all in that global CSS and hand them out to the different projects. And also, as I mentioned, you handed them out to the different projects. This, of course, talks to collaboration. So it's organization, but also collaboration. So if you're developers, you're going to have different developers likely on different websites, right? You have your 4 websites, you have your 6 websites, you hand it out to the different dev teams. Now you're actually collaborating, and the developers can collaborate different things, such as, hey, the contrast in dark mode was a little bit so we changed it. Is this cool that we changed a global.css? You kind of have that meeting. Hey, you know what? You're right. The contrast wasn't great for accessibility purposes. Let's fire off, an update to the global.css across all of our websites. And that's some great collaboration and great organization and easy to fix. Something goes wrong there, oh, it's in the global.css. We can just change it back, revert it, or make a future update. Now, one thing that's really unfortunate is that if you start using inline styles, which inline styles are important, but if you start using inline styles or JavaScript-based CSS manipulations, you're going to start having some weird problems. So this is a pitfall of sort of organized CSS, or more specifically, sort of CSS on advanced projects or advanced layouts. So let me give you an example. Let's just say you use WordPress, you use a theme, and then you also use some plugins. Well, at the end of the day, for whatever reason, you swear you've changed the color to orange for this link, but this one stubborn link just keeps changing to red. It keeps showing up red. You don't want it to be red. So you go into an inline style somewhere and you say, that's it. I'm making this thing orange. Well, down the road, years later, the company actually changes its color to red. And so they go, you know what? We need to change this thing to red. Well, let's think about the layers of all this right now. You got WordPress that's manipulating colors and styles and layouts. You got a theme that's doing the exact same thing, closely related, obviously, to WordPress because it's the WordPress theme. And then you're going to also have any sort of plugin that maybe is manipulating your link. Now, some of these things are going to be doing CSS manipulations through JavaScript. Some of them are going to be inline. Some of them are going to be, through a style sheet. And then there's another style sheet that comes in, because if you're not aware, CSS does, the name cascading. So if you have like your link at the top of your file be orange, and then later on in the file, it's red, it's going to become red, right? As you scroll, as it reads through, it's like, make the link orange, now make the link red. So now you're going to start seeing, right? The wheels will probably start turning in your head. You're like, oh my God, how many places is this link being set? Like orange, red, orange, red, orange, red, orange, red, orange, red. And then the company changes to red. And then they show up and they go, oh, I need to put another layer, whether that be inline commonly or otherwise, to make sure that this thing stays red. So now all this logic and all this stuff has happened, and it's made the link red originally. You wanted it orange. You went in, did an install change to change it. Now someone else is going to come in and go like, no, I don't want this stupid link to be orange. I don't know where it's been changed. I'm going to add another JavaScript CSS manipulation to make this thing red. So now this thing is flipping back and forth, back and forth, back and forth before it gets to the user. And this is where CSS gets a bad rap, because people start thinking, this is too complex. This is all over the place. And it can be, again, there's lots of tools at your disposal, but There's lots of tools at your disposal, but if you use them properly, if you organize them properly, then hopefully you can mitigate a lot of these things. So at the end of the day, if you use something like, and I'm just going to touch on this briefly right now, I'm not going to get into it, but if you find yourself running into a lot of these problems, what you can do is you can, of course, separate your things into different style sheets, which we already discussed. But you can also use something which we haven't talked about, which is something like a CSS framework, for example, BEM, and this may help you maintain clarity. Now, BEM and some other naming sort of conventions, they haven't really been super popular in the zeitgeist, at least. I don't have numbers in front of me. I didn't run a poll or anything like that. But it is something to consider if you're like, this is just getting out of control. So you may think to yourself, well, I mean, there are inline styles and there are style sheets. Why the heck can't we use one or the other, right? So when should you use inline styles? Inline styles are great for quick one-off changes where a style sheet edit would be excessive. Maybe it's excessive in the actual dev environment itself where you're pushing changes and it's really messy. So for example, an inline style change often will happen in the CMS. Usually the CMS, whether it's WordPress or otherwise, will have just a quick way where you can quickly just add a bit of inline style, and that's perfect. The first thing comes to mind is when someone's messing around with a rich text field that allows them to embed things. If they have a quick one-off component that they don't want to bug the devs for, and it's just going to show up once in one blog post, they'll often make that HTML and CSS just together, right? Because inline styles are actually in the actual HTML inside of a style property. And so they'll make like a quick, image or a quick element just in the actual rich text because it's just that quick one-off. Also, something that's really specific, like highlighting a specific element, that's something that makes a lot of sense if you do inline styles, things like that. And so that's basically that. You don't want to rely super heavily on inline styles. Now, there are some people where they'll have a specific project where they just swear by inline styles due to performance or things like that. I mean, maybe they somehow get better performance out of it for their particular use case. Again, I'm talking in a very general level. A lot of people will have very specific use cases. So if you're a person that's like, hey, I only use inline styles because my style sheets or my website's really simple and it's like, one step away from just basic HTML, maybe that works great for you. There's 1,000,001 contexts out there, and that's just the case for some things. Now for style sheets, of course, style sheets help you maintain consistency across multiple pages and components, which we've already discussed. Style sheets are essential, I would say, for larger projects where styles need to be used, reused, and organized logically. If you have inline styles all over the place, that's going to be a freaking mess, right? So for example, I mentioned, highlighting a specific element. Well, that's great if it's like a one-off, a two-off, things like that. Maybe it's in that rich text field like I mentioned. But maybe we need to have some consistency in our highlighting. So we may make a class just literally called highlighted text or something like that, and make the background color yellow or make the text yellow, however it is you're trying to highlight your relevant text. So use inline styles sparingly because they're helpful, but they can bloat your HTML and make it hard to maintain. And style sheets are great for scalability, readability, and maintainability. Now, another common pitfall you may fall into with CSS, and this is something to avoid, is over-specificity in your selectors. So if you're overly specific with your selectors, this can lead to very rigid, really difficult to manage and maintain code. And your code ends up becoming really difficult to override or reuse. And that leads to more workarounds, such as forcing inline styles to make sure that something is working. So don't be overly specific. Now you might be like, what do you mean by being overly specific? Like I'm selecting a content box class, or I'm selecting promo ID or something like that. Like what do you mean? Well, some people will build like a really specific structure. Like you may say, I want specifically like the div element, and only if it has the article class, but only if it's contained within the main content thing, but only if it's an H1 title, and you can get really into it. So let's just take a common example. Let's just say you have a blog post page that lists all the blog posts and content boxes. Really common, right? Inside those content boxes, you have a title. And let's just, for the sake of conversation today, say it's an H1. Fair enough. Let's say that H1 has a title, like it's called title in its class. Its class that's been assigned to it is title. Well, you could say dot title in your style sheet, and that would address that. You may want to get more specific and say H1 dot title, right? You might want to get more specific and say, I only want H1s with the title class to do this. You're starting to get a little specific, but it's not too crazy. But what if you start saying, I specifically want, and I'm not going to read out the syntax, but I specifically want the first content box within the main content, within the body, that's an H1 that has you see how like this is starting to get, and then that style is only going to apply to that one single heading. At that point, to simplify that, you may just want an ID. Throw the ID on the first title in the first content box, have some simple property that highlights it or whatever it is you're trying to do specifically, and that's it. Instead of having this absolutely massive selector of like main content, no, it's actually a div in an article, and if it's not a div and it's in an A tag, anchor tag, if it's in there, then I don't want it too specific. So things like using ID, those are great for specific and one-off uses on a page, but then also having some practice, I say, with using more broad selectors, specifically class selectors, that are more adaptable to structural changes. So sort of kind of adopt a hierarchy strategy where general styles apply broadly and more specific rules cascade naturally by using either IDs, maybe using IDs and classes, or using multiple classes, or specific. You can even get specific elements in there too. But again, don't really pigeonhole it. Kind of cascade it down. Maybe you want to say, I want, all my H1s to be font size 10. Let's just hypothetically, and for the sake of conversation, font size 10. But I want H1s that are called title to be font size 12. Like, that's not too crazy. That's really easy to read. You fully understand it. It's like, oh, okay, elements that have the class title are going to be a little different. That's an easy to read example. And it's not the greatest example either. Like, I'm not going to go, I have some examples in the show notes. I'm not going to go in and read you okay, now we're going to add a greater than sign. Now we're going to add an asterisk for a wild card. Like, no, it's not going to work for an audio show. So that's kind of the pitfalls, some of the things you can avoid, some of the things that you should do to kind of get the basics done right. Make sure you're using your classes correctly. Make sure you're using your IDs correctly. That's kind of the very, very basics that we talked about just kind of throughout the episode with nothing specific. But organizing those style sheets, making sure that you use inline styles when appropriate, not excessively using them. Things like that are going to make your layouts in CSS just way, way better. Devs, this one's for you. I've got 30 seconds to tell you about Wix Studio, the web platform for agencies and enterprises. So here are a few things you can do in 30 seconds or less on Studio. Integrate, extend, and write custom scripts in a VS Code-based IDE. Leverage zero setup dev, test, and production environments. Ship faster with an AI code assistant. And work with Wix headless APIs on any tech stack. Time's up, but the list keeps going. Step into Wix Studio and see for yourself. Link in the show description and in the show notes.
I have something that I kind of want to add to this and this is something that took me a while to understand fully, and I definitely fell for the pitfalls of not knowing it. And it's actually what the layers of CSS are and how they relate to the actual specificity and what gets applied to your code, right? Like what styles get applied. So Matt's already mentioned a couple of times, like inline styles, internal styling, right? In the style tag, and how specificity matters a lot, right? When you're talking about the styles that you're writing. Well, I think you need to understand where you need to write styles and which ones are going to be applied from an actual overview, right? So I'm going to give you all the layers of CSS and how to override each layer. The first layer is the browser's default styles. Every browser has built-in styles that have already been in there. So like we have H1s that are bold by default. That's a browser's H1. That's a browser's default style. These are the weakest styles. So these are the ones that are the most easy to overwrite. The next is the 3 layers of styles, right? So we have external, which is the farthest style sheet. So that's like a styles.css file, right? That's an external style. Then we have internal styles. So that's a style tag inside of the actual HTML file. That is treated as a higher cascade priority. So you can overwrite your styles.css import with a style tag inside that file, and you can put, any CSS you want within the two style tags. And then the highest level, and the one that overwrites the internal styles, is the inline styles that Matt was talking about. So again, inline styles, highest level, internal, and then external styles. And then inside of the internal and external styles, you can also start overriding things with specificity. So Matt already mentioned how the more specificity you have, the more likely it is to overwrite. A p tag with the color, assigned the color blue, is going to be less specific than a class called special or something like that with the color green. So the color green is going to overwrite it if that p tag has the class special on it. And on top of that, the way to overwrite everything is with an important tag, or with a bang important, right? Like, so exclamation point important. An exclamation point important is really important to know will override regardless of the order of strength. So an external style sheet with an important is going to overwrite an inline style if it's referencing the same thing. Okay, so if you put an important tag on the P, right, like on the paragraph tag, inside an external style sheet, inside your styles.css, and then all of your paragraphs will always be blue, okay? Unless you have another P below it somewhere, because the order of specificity actually matters from top to bottom as well, right? So the lower you have something, the more specific it's going to be. And that's really the gist of it. So as long as you understand the idea that browser defaults, lowest level, then external, internal, inline, right? And then at the end of it is the important.
Yeah, we're going to actually talk about important as well, but you make a really, really good point, Mike, in that, like, having things be like applied in this cascading way and specificity, like when we talk about it, like specificity can get really, really specific. Like I've watched people almost do like a formula where they're like, this is a specificity of level 2 and things like that. You can get really, really into it, but the thing that Mike just laid out for you is basically what you need to know. And as you practice, like, you'll get it. You'll be like, oh, okay, this one's overwriting this one because it's further down. This one's overwriting this one because it's inline. This one's overwriting this one because of it's important. There's going to be some instances where you're going to almost need that formula, it feels like, where you're like, oh my God, like how specific is this thing? We're not going to cover those specifically today, but I just wanted to touch on that, is that specificity, it sounds complex and simple at the same time, but there is a very complex angle to it. Like you can get really into it, and I don't do that. So I just want to be like, point that out to everybody that like most people are not figuring out the actual like specificity score, if that's what it's even called, of things in particular. Most people are doing exactly what Mike's saying, where it's just like, this will overwrite this will overwrite this will overwrite this, and this is how we're going to generally organize our CSS. But if you get stuck on something, you might be stuck in one of those really specific CSS problems. And those honestly are things that we're trying to avoid by having some best practices.
And this matters most when you're coming into an existing project with a million different style sheets and inline styles. Understanding the layers of the cascading layers of CSS, CSS is cascading layers, will make it way easier for you to go in and know where to look for actually overwriting stuff and what's overwriting what. Like Matt's saying, like, it's just knowing the layers is going to level up your CSS by 10x, I guarantee you. And I didn't know it until way too late in my career, and that's why I'm kind of mentioning it.
Honestly, the dev tools are really helpful for that too, because you can like go and see, be like, oh, what is applying, red to this link? It kind of, if we use my previous example, and you could be like, oh, it's this selector. Where's the selector coming out? Then you can like look through your style sheets and be like, oh, this is the selector. Or like, I don't see that in my style sheets. Maybe I got to check the JS, right? Maybe the JavaScript is coming in and applying CSS styles without me realizing it. So things like that, you got to kind of hunt down CSS problems is kind of the way it is. And like, once you get used to doing it, like I can find them almost always pretty quick. Sometimes I get stuck though. Like some of them get pretty complicated. So if you're stuck and you're like, this is so stupid, like, yeah, it is kind of stupid. Like it feels horrible being like, I just want an underline here. I just want this text to be slightly different, and I just cannot get this thing to change colors. Like that sucks. going to touch very briefly on modern layout tools that help, keep your CSS organized. Not going to get into like how they work fully and things like that, but just some things such as Flexbox. Flexbox is super, super helpful. It's ideal for one-dimensional layouts, rows or columns, and it's really helpful that way. Now, if you want like a really rigid two-dimensional layout, meaning you like really specifically want your content boxes in a very specific grid, achieving this in something like Flexbox is really, really annoying. So then we also have CSS Grid, of course. This allows you to tackle complex layouts with ease, but with that complexity comes complexity. And CSS Grid can be a bit of a pain to maintain and change for certain layouts. Sometimes you might be like, man, I just want this to be like, just like a little bit different. And CSS Grid might be a little bit too rigid for you. So you have to kind of choose between these two layouts. Now, of course, you can also just sort of use, I think it's just the box model. You can do that, and you can like just sort of like constantly move stuff around with like floats and things like that. But that's less modern. Like, I don't use that stuff anymore. I don't use float clears. I don't use floats anymore. If I do, I'm maintaining old code. I use Flexbox like 99% of the times, and like 1% of the time I use Grid. But you can also combine Grid and Flexbox together. My rule of thumb in general is that if my design can be done in Flexbox, I do it in Flexbox. That might be a little bit of personal bias because I'm so experienced with it. It is also older than Grid. At least in my learning, it's older than Grid. Now, Grid is great for, again, achieving things that are very, very, very specific. But like I said, you can combine the two to yield the best results. You can sometimes use Grid, let's say, to really get a rigid layout with your wrappers. Like if you have a bunch of very specific wrappers, and then inside of the wrapper divs, you can then use Flexbox to be a little bit more liberal within those sort of rigid layout areas, if you will. So I recommend Flexbox and Grid for tackling CSS, responsive designs, for tackling most modern layouts. We used to use display block, display inline block, and then move things around and margin auto, this and that. We use that a little bit, but not as much as Flexbox and Grid these days. And then also, there's of course media queries and container queries. So as your screen size starts to shrink, you sometimes need to have a different breakpoint, is what it's called. And what that means is let's say, for example, you have 3 content boxes left to right, in a row, and they all take up a third. Well, having 3 content boxes all squished on a smartphone screen when it's in portrait kind of sucks. So what you really want to do is you're going to want to have a different breakpoint where maybe once it hits the average iPhone in portrait screen, let's say, size, you're going to want those content boxes to have a width of 100%. And they're actually going to go into one column effectively then. So you may use things like media queries. So media queries are tied to the viewport, and this allows them to actually adjust based on what the user is actually viewing. When a user is on a smartphone, most of the time their browser is the full size of the screen. Most apps take up the full size of the screen. Yes, there are some cases where the viewport is not the full size of the screen of the iPhone because someone's multitasking, things like that. But most of the time it's the full size. And so the viewport is literally what the person is seeing. The viewport also takes effect on desktop as well, of course. Like if you take your desktop screen and it's, let's say, 1080p, and you take the actual browser and you cut it down to half the width, like you actually drag the window to be half the width. I mean, the viewport is no longer, 1920 wide, like it's half of the 1920. It actually does cut it down. You can use, though, some different things such as container queries. So container queries allow styles to be applied based on the size of the container and not just the viewport. So if what you're doing is all based on that viewport example, go for it. Use a media query, set those breakpoints. But container queries is a more modern way to actually change things when it doesn't necessarily have to be completely affected by the viewport. And this offers you more granular control. So for example, a card component can adjust its layout within a grid based on the available space without relying on overall screen dimensions. So you can see how CSS Grid's coming into this as well, where you can actually say, hey, if that CSS grid hits a certain thing, I want the actual style to change. So we're starting to get a lot of really advanced and I would say useful, but I mean, a little bit hard sometimes to remember and hard to understand all these different layers to CSS. But there are some really powerful ways to achieve the design that you want without resorting to floats and like position absolute where you're being pixel perfect, things like that. We're really like CSS really seems to be building toward the responsive future because people are going to use your website on a number of devices, and that's not going anywhere anytime soon. The day of the family computer where everyone just logs into one computer is gone, and that's not where CSS is going, and it's not where CSS has been for a number of years. You can also use other things that, and this is going to be more advanced, so I'm just going to touch on it, called custom properties, otherwise known as CSS Variables. I have actually a full piece on this on the HTML All the Things website, a full guide and kind of an exploration article, if you will. And variables allow you to, I mean, quite literally have things be variable. So, for example, you may have something like your main brand color be in a variable called like main brand color, and you can call that in whenever you want in like a font, in like a class that's defining your font color, or that's defining the color of your links, things like that. You can also use CSS variables to help change the theme of your website. Now, I don't mean seasonal theme, although I'm sure it'd be helpful there too. Most common theme type is going to be a light or a dark mode. So CSS variables really help do this dynamically. And what this allows you to do is, let's just say your main brand color is red and you're using the hex code. So it's just 2 Fs and the rest of them are zeros. What you really could do is you can have that, the 2 Fs and the zeros set in one place, and then everywhere you need to have that color set, you call upon the variable. Let's say down the road, new owner, something like that comes in, you no longer need, your main brand color is no longer red, it's now blue. You don't need to go in and change blue in every single spot where the color's set. You set it where the variable was set, you save, you push your change, and it will automatically go in, because those areas where you're calling the variable, it'll just call the new value now. So this helps with maintainability. This helps with the themes, like I said, light and dark mode. And this also helps you keep things organized. And you can also, kind of mess with having CSS variables be really helpful in things like the global CSS file, right? We talked about the global CSS file. A lot of CSS variables will actually be declared in there. Some people will actually have a variables CSS sheet where they'll have something separate. Again, this is kind of up to you and your own organization, but CSS variables or custom properties is really, really helpful. And this is going to be one of the final things that we're going to talk about today, but some methodologies for some scalable projects. So I talked really briefly earlier in the episode about BEM, which is basically like a naming convention for CSS. And this is not something that, the browser honors or anything like that. This is purely like humans organizing CSS, right? So I don't use these. I'm going to be clear. I did a little research on them for this episode, but I am not an expert in these at all. So what is BEM? And there's also another one called OOCSS, another one called SMACSS as well. And they all have different methods. These methods are supposed to help you work on big projects or projects that will scale to be big projects. So the first one, BEM or BEM, focuses on creating reusable components with a clear naming convention, making large projects easier to manage. The next one, OOCSS, emphasizes separating structure and skin to promote reusable styles across elements. And SMACSS categorizes styles into modules, base, layout, and state to simplify maintenance. Now, you may say, like, that's a big bunch of word soup. How do I choose which one's right for me? You need to start looking at which one you like. First and foremost, if you hate one of them and you don't see yourself ever liking them, like that plays a part. But also consider the project size and complexity. So take a look at the project and say, how complex is it today? How complex is it going to be tomorrow? And actually, really, do you even need one of these? I don't use these. I tried BEM for a while and was just like, eh. So I kind of have my own way that I organize my CSS classes. I've been doing it for years. Yes, it's a little similar to BEM. Yeah, it's a little similar to this, that, with everything. It's kind of like inspired by some, but I just do it personally. I just keep myself organized, and I have a common naming scheme that I use for a lot of things. And that's just the way that I organize it. But in my research, I found that BEM is great for component heavy applications generally, whereas OOCSS is great for simple but scalable solutions. And SMACSS, woo-wee, lots of letters, is great for larger projects requiring structured categorization. And I encourage you to go and look this up more. Totally don't just take, again, I just did a little bit of research for this section of the episode. If you're you're having trouble with the scalability of your CSS, totally take a look at these. Now, I ultimately just want to talk about why you'd even take a look at this. It's the same reason why you would take a look at a framework or a tool set, such as a React, a Svelte, something like that. It gives your developers, meaning multiple developers in a team, some very commonly used CSS, or JavaScript. They're going in and they're using, the same way of Svelte updates the page this way, so they're all doing it that way. React updates the page this way, so they're all doing it that way. You can use other things Mike has talked about in the past, linters and different things like that, to get things really, really to be similar across your team. But the main thing here is that you're trying to add a layer of consistency so that, Mike, for example, he's working on the CSS. He can go in and look at my CSS and not be like, Matt, what's this? Matt, what's that? Matt, what's this? He knows, okay, there's a similar naming scheme, and the company probably has adopted an even more granular naming scheme within BEM or within any of these other methods. And so he's able to not only immediately or very quickly figure out what I wrote in my CSS styles, but if we hire another developer, I can go to them and say, we wrote this in BEM, make sure you use BEM. Here's our, some of our specific quirks in our project. Go and take a look. And they're going to be able to more quickly be able to Google the actual solution and be able to figure out what exactly is going on. Now, this is going to be difficult to implement. This is not easy to completely change your styles if you haven't been using these things already. So what I recommend is you start by introducing one methodology in a pilot project. Don't be using BEM and OOCSS, and don't be doing that, right? And you need to have some really good documentation and an internal wiki or maybe an internal blog or something like that. Document your naming conventions, document how you're respecting, these different naming conventions, and have a bunch of best practices for team-wide adoption. Have things like, when you want to make a content box, use this method, use this is how we want to do it. And also, don't be afraid of refactoring. What you're writing today may need to be refactored in the future, even if you're using a naming scheme like this. Just make sure that you're able to say, you know what, guys, we need to update how our content boxes work because we're becoming, not productive, or the project is scaling outside of what we wrote originally.
With stuff like this, like BEM specifically, I've used BEM quite heavily on a couple of different projects. It really only starts to make sense when you are anticipating you're going to be working in larger teams. Like Matt said, the conformity is where this becomes really important. Because like I was mentioning before with the whole cascading, as soon as you come into a project where everything is kind of all over the place, without some sort of actual framework for how you're writing your CSS, now whether that framework be these kind of naming methodologies, because that's really all these are, is how do you name different styles, or an actual framework like Tailwind, something else, or Bootstrap, which we'll talk about later, whether it be one of those options, these are really designed to make it easier for anyone to come into your code and understand what's going on with your style, with your styling. That's why there's these obvious naming conventions, obvious little things that are just, you have to conform to. It's for the readability and the maintainability of your code. It's not going to make you a faster solo developer. Just not. It's going to make it a little bit harder because every time you're creating a class, you're going to have to think a little bit more on how you're going to be naming that class. I think that's a good thing. I'm not saying that that's for everyone, but again, I think it's important to think that way if your intention is to eventually be working in larger teams. Even if it's for a smaller project, that's kind of your way of getting to scalability, of getting to be placed in a team that you can provide immediate value into, both from understanding what's being written and being able to contribute to it. So it's just my opinion, but it's a good thing to start to understand.
Yeah, like right now, like a lot of the projects that I work on are solo projects. And so like Mike brings up a good thing. It's like these projects are generally not going to scale too much. And if they do, like I'm going to be there to say, okay, hey, like we're going to have to switch to a naming convention. We're going to have to switch to some standardized things. But like I'm going to be able to help move and help scale and help transition, I guess, into a new method of doing CSS. But for right now, it just doesn't make sense, especially when a lot of what you do on a website, especially if it's a simple website, is like content box, maybe like a slider or maybe like a carousel here and there is going to be your most advanced thing. And then I'm not going to make each of my carousels, reinvent the wheel and restart. I'm going to use as many of my old styles as possible. So for me personally, like when I'm working with just me or maybe one other person, it's okay that we just have our own naming convention in that, because we are still using all the best practices, or as many as we can, that I've mentioned in the episode before these naming conventions. We're still using, still reusing classes, not overusing IDs, not overusing inline styles, things like that. Those best practices go a long way. And I would say that these, something like BEM is kind of a final sort of like, hey, we need organization. Like this is getting out of hand. And the size of those projects, like I haven't hit those size of those projects. I haven't needed to do that. Now, I know some people are going to swear by BEM and that's fine. If you're a person that absolutely needs rigid structure, fair enough. But a lot of the time, like, again, like I haven't heard of BEM in a long time. Like I know it's still around and things like that, but like a lot of people just don't use it anymore, because it's just, I think the other fundamentals of CSS and the amount of new features of CSS have allowed us to cut down on the amount of styles that we have so much and use them so effectively for responsive design that we just haven't needed BEM too much. Now, there is a guy, I can't remember the name of the creator, unfortunately, right now, but there is a guy that uses a lot of like utility classes and things like that in Webflow. And that's actually something that I want to check out, because with Webflow, I understand I'm talking about a no-code tool, but it uses a lot of standard CSS things, including classes. And this guy swears by using utility classes and a strict naming convention. Watched a couple of his videos here and there, but I do want to kind of like try it on a small side project, because maybe my opinion of this is going to get debunked. But for now, I mean, I've been successful professionally doing this. No one's come back and said like, oh my God, this is a mess or anything. So I mean, unless everyone has just been polite to me, I haven't disastered anything using my own methods of CSS. Now, I do want to talk a little bit here about accessibility in CSS. So color contrast and readability obviously make a huge thing. So you can make a huge difference, not a huge thing. So you can use tools such as one called Web Aim Contrast Checker, or even some browser dev tools, and they will allow you to check and improve contrast ratios for certain visual impairments. So that's really helpful. And you can also do things such as allowing yourself to actually scroll to read all the text on things. So for example, something like the table example in the beginning of the episode, I mean, that doesn't sound like accessibility, but it absolutely is. Like being able to actually scroll around and see all the content is key. You don't want things to be cut off. Also, a really common contrast issue that people will run into is they'll put images on top, they'll put text over top of an image, and they'll assume that the contrast is enough, but that's not always the case, because maybe the bottom of the image, the actual picture, is dark, so you put some white text down there, but as the image shrinks in width, if the actual screen size, the viewport shrinks, now that image or the text itself may wrap and go higher up on the image, and now it's like white on like a bright part of the image and you can't see. So sometimes those contrast checkers help with that as well. Also, the use of focus states, using the focus states effectively, this can help for people that use keyboard navigation. I'm no expert in this, but that absolutely helps. And also try to avoid some harmful patterns in CSS. This is not just CSS though. So things such as like, if you have a button that isn't an actual button in HTML, and then you just like use your CSS though, this is where CSS comes in, to style like a random div as a button, that's not great for accessibility. And there's ways around it. You can do like ARIA label and ARIA role and stuff like that. Sometimes you need to do that, but you don't want to hide things to make screen readers and other accessibility tools have trouble figuring things out. And CSS is really good at hiding things. So like taking like a form input or a form, of a various input type, not just text, and making a facade is great. But the facade generally looks amazing, but a screen reader is going to be like, why is there an input box and then also like some other weird input box? It's going to get really confusing. And so you really have to be careful with that type of stuff. And CSS, whereas it isn't necessarily, let's say, the direct culprit, it's definitely the lipstick that makes things look good for those that don't use accessibility tools. And so CSS is a very important like kind of piece to this puzzle. I also mentioned the contrast property, or rather the contrast function. So you can actually adjust the contrast of an image in CSS. So you can actually mess around with that with different filters and things like that. If you really want to get into like making sure the images look good for those that maybe are colorblind or things like that, that gets like really, really into it though. It's really complex. But if you want to try to do that for accessibility reasons or convenience reasons for your users, absolutely do that. There's also a media feature in CSS called prefers contrast, and it's used to detect whether the user has requested the web content to be presented with a higher or lower contrast. And I believe that is done through browser settings, if I remember correctly, but I have only ever used that one time, so don't quote me fully on that. But as you can see, there's a lot of features in CSS. There's a lot of things that, touch on, you do things your own self or organization, but there's stuff that talks to whatever, the browser, things like that. There's a lot that goes into CSS. And then there's going to be some, so there's going to be some upcoming things like that you should keep an eye on, such as scroll linked animations and those type of things that will allow you to cut down on the amount of JavaScript you're using and use what is generally the more performant CSS. So definitely keep an eye out for any new features like that. And there's one other thing that I want to talk about, and we've already talked about it really briefly. Mike brought it up, is the important rule. Now, I think Mike referred to it as bang important, but I'm just going to call it exclamation mark important. That's how you write it down. And basically, it allows you to override the typical cascading order and specificity of styles. Now, this sounds like it could be handy. It sounds like it could be dangerous, and it's a little bit of both. So how it works is you have your property like normal. So you have like your property, let's just say you have the color property. You want to set it to red. No matter what, you can go property, red, and then put this important at the end of the property. This works in your CSS style sheet. It will also work in your HTML if you're using the style property, of course. And it does what it says. It makes the change of that color important, and it forces it to be that color. The problem with this is that it makes things take precedence over other rules. And as we've discussed throughout this entire episode, having your CSS methodologies and properties and other different like naming schemes and all the other stuff be organized and be sort of like properly managed, having all that stuff be all put together well is really, really critical. And this kind of spits in the face of that a little bit. Now, it's not, a super bad thing to use or anything like that. And in fact, it's really handy sometimes. So think about it in an emergency where someone contacts you and it's like, oh my God, we're about to run this sale and I can't see the coupon code because for some reason the background is red and the text is red. And you go in as a developer, you're about to run out to dinner and you're like, I don't know where the heck the font color or the background color is here. I'm just going to quickly do a quick and dirty fix with an important. That's totally reasonable. And that totally makes sense. And is something that you should actually use important for. The problem comes in is when you may or may not forget to remove that important down the road. Or even worse, if we just leave that example in the dust and we think of another one where someone is using important left, right, and center. It's all over the place. It's in the inline. It's in the style sheets. It's actually in a couple of different spots in the style sheet. So it's actually now playing a role where it's cascading, where one important is overriding another important because the other important was read later and was like, it's like deeper in the document, right? It's further down the actual style sheet, cascaded down. This starts becoming really, really problematic. And as I said, spits in the face of any sort of other organizational system that you may have. So it's extremely important to realize that important is there, and you should, or you can use it, but you should avoid its use as much as possible. And that's kind of my last kind of piece on that is, it's really, really helpful in emergencies. It's also really, really helpful for temporarily overriding things if you're debugging. Also, sometimes if just, some plugin, like a WordPress plugin, just will not give in on a certain style, and you swear you've said it, and you're just like, all right, that's it. I got to go, unconventional. I got to fix this. Maybe using an important in there makes a lot of sense. But again, don't overuse it. It's helpful, but it's also hurtful.
Yeah, no, I think you've covered it really well, like the whole scope of CSS from a podcast perspective. Like we mentioned earlier, I'd highly recommend looking into stuff like Tailwind. And I don't know if Bootstrap is what I would recommend today, but Tailwind is becoming very much a standard in a lot of projects. I think a lot of the reason why BEM isn't talked about as much is because Tailwind kind of came in and made standards a little bit easier to work with, where you don't have to be thinking specifically about naming. Tailwind takes that part of the actual CSS implementation away. You're just writing CSS, and it's almost like it's allowing you to write really clean inline CSS. People say don't write CSS inline because most of the time it's bad performance, it's bad for cascading. But realistically, it's actually really nice to assign CSS directly to the elements that you're creating through HTML, from HTML, right? So that's what stuff like Bootstrap and Tailwind allow you to do, and that's why people like it. There is a lot of opposition, obviously, to stuff like that because, it wasn't the way things were back in the day, and so people like to do the way they've styled forever. And there are some actual legitimate complaints about Tailwind. Obviously, it's not the perfect thing. But overall, I've done both. I've done a lot of, BEM style, SAS style CSS. I've done regular CSS, and I've fully switched on all projects to Tailwind. And it's actually really, really easy to learn once you have an understanding of how CSS works. I really do recommend you understand CSS first, just like we talk about with all pillars. Understand the base pillar and then build on top of it. Once you understand it, writing Tailwind becomes a lot easier, and using CSS becomes a lot easier, in my opinion. That's just my spiel, but that's all I have to say about CSS. Yeah, great job, Matt.
Well, thank you. Yeah, no, I just want to touch on what you said, Mike, is like learning CSS, at least at a very basic level, even can help you use no-code tools. You can easily override styles. I know we said overriding is not the greatest, but sometimes you need to. And so understanding, how to override styles is great. Also, things like Elementor, page builder like Elementor within WordPress, is starting to use Flexbox and things like that. So knowing generally like what you're looking for here and there is really great. This is especially true in Webflow, of course, where you actually like click the display flex button rather than write the property display flex. So that, it's very important for in that regard as well. But that's it. That concludes the episode. I'm going to try to have another one next time it's my episode specifically. I'm going to have another one on JS, and then hopefully these will be our pillar episodes, talking about, of course, the 3 pillars, bit of an updated look. So if you want to support episodes like this, you can do so by going to visit us on Patreon. That's patreon.com/HTML, all the things, and many thanks to our $3 tier patrons, Tim from the Web Hacker on thewebhacker.com, Jason from Geek Life Radio via geekliferadio.com, Garrett Segal, Level Up Financial Planning via www.levelupfinancialplanning.com, Magnus from YesWeb via yesweb.se, Syntaxify from the HTML All the Things Discord server, and Stacy Mosteler from the website swoonworthydesigns.com. And we'd like to give a shout out to Michael LaRocca, contributing author on HTMLallthethings.com. Michael is the author of Self-Taught the X Generation blog at selftaughttxg.com. Feel free to leave a comment or review the platform that you are listening to this on. And this outro will sign us off.
You You've been listening to HTML All the Things podcast. Web development, web design, and small business. We hope you've gotten some useful and practical information from this show. And we hope you appreciate that we talk to you like human beings. And we hope you had some fun. We'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hit us up on social media on Facebook, Instagram, and Patreon at HTML All the Things. And on Twitter at HTML Everything. Until next time, this is HTML All the Things, signing off.